The hallway outside Studio B had once echoed with applause so loud that even the security guards would pause just to listen. But on that quiet afternoon, it carried only the dull hum of fluorescent lights and the distant shuffle of cables being dragged across the floor. A sound that felt more like an ending than preparation. Dean Martin walked through that corridor with the same steady pace he had carried for decades. His posture relaxed, his expression calm. Yet anyone who looked closely could see that the warmth in his famous smile was now guarded. As if he had learned that sometimes the loudest rooms could turn silent without warning. The studio doors were half open, and inside a small group of producers stood around a monitor, speaking in hushed voices that stopped the moment they noticed him. No one greeted him the way they once did. No cheerful jokes, no playful applause. Just a polite nod that felt strangely formal, as though the room had already decided something before he arrived. The entertainment world had always moved fast, but lately it seemed to move without memory. New voices, new faces, new trends each, one arriving with the promise that yesterday's legends were no longer necessary. For weeks there had been quiet conversations behind closed doors. Emails sent late at night, meetings that Dean had not been invited to. None of it had been said directly to his face, yet the message floated through the air like dust in sunlight. Maybe his time had passed. The studio had scheduled a special recording session, officially described as a tribute rehearsal, but everyone inside knew that sometimes tributes were simply polite ways of closing chapters. Dean paused just inside the doorway and took in the scene with the patience of a man who had seen both roaring success and uncomfortable silence. Technicians adjusted microphones without looking at him. A young assistant flipped through cue cards with nervous hands. On the far side of the room, a producer leaned toward another and whispered something that ended with a quick glance in Dean's direction. It wasn't hostility. It was something quieter and more complicated uncertainty, mixed with the cautious distance people keep when they think someone's era might be over. He walked toward the stage anyway. Not with defiance, but with a quiet dignity that had always defined him. The stage lights were still warming up, casting a soft amber glow across the polished floor. For a moment he stood there alone, remembering nights when the same lights had ignited crowds into laughter and song within seconds. Back then, the room never doubted him. Back then, he never had to prove he belonged. Now, even the air felt like it was waiting for evidence. A junior producer finally approached. Clipboard pressed against his chest as though it were a shield. His voice was respectful but careful. "We're just running a few tests today," he said, choosing each word like it might break if handled roughly. "Nothing official, just seeing how things feel." Dean nodded, understanding the language behind the language. In studios, seeing how things feel often meant deciding whether someone still fit the picture. The network wanted to paint. He moved to the microphone, adjusting it slightly, not because it was wrong, but because familiar routines gave the mind something steady to hold on to. Around him, conversations resumed in low tones. One of the newer executives, a man known for chasing whatever trend was currently popular, folded his arms and watched with an expression that wasn't cruel, just skeptical. The kind of look that silently asked whether nostalgia had a place in a world obsessed with the next big thing. Dean didn't rush. He never had. Instead, he glanced across the empty seats and imagined them filled. Not with critics, but with ordinary people, couples who had once danced to his songs in their living rooms. Workers who had ended long days with his voice playing softly on the radio. Families who associated his music with moments of comfort. Those memories were not statistics on a chart. They were quiet proof that impact wasn't measured only by what was trending this week. Somewhere near the control booth, a voice perhaps not meant to carry murmured, "Maybe it's time we try someone fresher." It wasn't loud, but in a quiet studio, even soft words can travel. Dean heard it. He didn't react outwardly, yet something deep inside him shifted. Not toward anger, but toward clarity. After a lifetime in the spotlight, he understood that every career eventually reaches a moment when others begin to write the ending for you. The sound engineer signaled that the microphone was live. "Whenever you're ready," he said, offering a small, encouraging smile that felt genuine amid the tension. Dean closed his eyes for a second, not dramatically, just long enough to center himself, then opened them with that familiar calm that had carried him through countless performances. He didn't launch into a grand introduction. He simply spoke a quiet greeting, warm and steady, the kind that felt like a conversation rather than a performance. At first, nothing remarkable happened. A few people shifted their weight. Someone checked their phone. The room remained cautious, as if waiting for proof that the past could still breathe in the present. Dean began with a simple line, not pushed, not forced. Delivered with the ease of someone who understood that true confidence rarely needs to announce itself. His voice carried not louder than before, but richer. Layered with years of experience that no trend could manufacture, one of the technicians looked up from the console. Then another. The skeptical executive's posture changed slightly, arms loosening without him realizing it. There was something in the tone, not just musical, but human, that made the room pause. It wasn't about hitting perfect notes. It was about the feeling behind them, a quiet assurance that comes only from someone who has lived through both applause and doubt. And learned not to depend entirely on either, Dean continued, letting the melody unfold at its own pace. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply telling a story the way he always had, honestly, without unnecessary decoration. The studio, which had felt like a waiting room for a farewell, began to shift into something else. Conversations stopped. Even the faint rustle of papers seemed to disappear. The atmosphere didn't explode into excitement. Instead, it settled into a deep, attentive stillness, the kind that appears when people realize they're witnessing something authentic near the back. The young assistant who had been flipping through cue cards lowered them slowly, eyes fixed on the stage. He had grown up in an era of fast edits and louder performances, yet this quieter presence held his attention in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't nostalgia, it was connection, a reminder that sincerity can cross generations when it's delivered without pretense. As the final phrase of the verse lingered in the air, the room remained silent for a heartbeat longer than usual, as though no one wanted to break the moment too quickly. Dean didn't look around for approval. He simply rested his hand lightly against the microphone stand, breathing evenly, comfortable with whatever response would come. That calm and hurried, unbothered, spoke as loudly as any note he had just sung. Inside the control booth, the skeptical executive exchanged a glance with another producer. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden applause, yet just a shared realization that something they had quietly assumed might be over was, in fact, still very much alive. The narrative they had begun to write that his time had passed no longer felt certain. Dean adjusted the microphone again, this time with a faint smile that wasn't about victory but about peace. He had not come to prove anyone wrong. He had come to be present, to do the work he loved with the same integrity he had always carried. Whether the room erupted or stayed quiet no longer defined his worth. That understanding, earned over years, gave his presence a steadiness that trends could not shake. The studio lights hummed softly above, casting long reflections across the polished floor, and for the first time that afternoon, the space no longer felt like a place preparing for an ending. It felt like a room reconsidering its assumptions. No grand announcement had been made, no speech delivered, just a voice, calm and sincere. It's reminding everyone that relevance is not always measured by noise. Sometimes it is measured by the silence that follows when people realize they've been listening more closely than they intended, and in that quiet, suspended moment before anyone spoke, before any decision was finalized, the entire studio seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing that what they had just witnessed was not a comeback staged for attention, but a simple, undeniable truth. Authenticity does not expire on a schedule. The silence that followed his final note did not break into applause right away. And in that suspended space, somewhere between expectation and realization, the room seemed to shift its weight, as though every person present was quietly reconsidering something they had believed just minutes earlier. Dean Martin did not rush to fill that silence. He had learned long ago that the most powerful moments in any performance were often the ones where nothing happened at all, where people simply sat with what they had just felt. He stepped back half a pace from the microphone, not as a retreat, but as an acknowledgement that the moment now belonged to the room as much as it belonged to him. Inside the control booth, The atmosphere had changed in a way that could not be measured by any chart or rating sheet. The skeptical executive who earlier had folded his arms with quiet doubt now leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on the stage. He did not speak, but the tension in his posture had softened, placed by a look that suggested calculation mixed with surprise. Around him, producers exchanged brief glances, the kind that carry unspoken questions. Did you feel that too? No one wanted to be the first to admit that the rehearsal they had expected to confirm an ending was instead complicating their narrative. One of the senior producers cleared his throat softly, as if preparing to restore the room to its original purpose. "All right," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Let's run the second segment." It was a practical instruction. Yet beneath it lingered a subtle urgency, as though moving quickly might prevent the moment from settling too deeply into everyone's perception. The schedule, after all, had been designed to test viability, not to rediscover presence. Dean nodded, adjusting the cuff of his jacket with a small, habitual motion that had accompanied countless performances over the years. He could sense the shift in the room, but he did not chase it. Chasing approval had never been his style. Instead, he focused on the simple mechanic's breath, posture, distance from the microphone details that grounded him in the present rather than in speculation about outcomes. Experience had taught him that when others were busy deciding your future, the only control you truly held was over the integrity of your next moment. Near the back, the young assistant who had earlier lowered his cue cards now whispered to a colleague, "He doesn't even look nervous." The colleague shrugged, eyes still fixed on the stage. "Maybe that's why people used to trust him," she replied quietly. Trust, an invisible currency in entertainment, could not be manufactured with louder lights or faster edits. It was built slowly, through consistency, through the subtle assurance that what you were seeing was real. The second segment was meant to be more demanding. A piece chosen specifically because it required both emotional range and technical precision. Earlier in private meetings, someone had suggested that this would be the moment where limitations, if any existed, would become obvious. The logic had been simple. If he struggled here, the decision would be easier for everyone involved. No confrontation, no harsh words, just a quiet pivot toward newer faces. As the music cue began, low and understated, Dean closed his eyes for a brief second, not for drama, but for focus, then opened them with the same calm steadiness that had defined his presence all afternoon. He didn't perform at the room. He performed with it, as though each note were part of a conversation rather than a display. The difference was subtle, yet it changed how the sound traveled, how it settled into the space. At first, the executive in the booth scribbled something on his pad, perhaps a reflex born from years of evaluating talent through metrics and projections. But after a few lines, his pen slowed. The room's attention was no longer fragmented. Even the technicians, usually occupied with levels and signals, found themselves glancing up more often than necessary. The performance was not loud or flashy. It was controlled, measured, deeply intentional, the kind of delivery that doesn't demand attention, but quietly earns it. Halfway through the segment, an unexpected interruption crackled through the intercom static, then a voice from another department asking for a quick confirmation about scheduling. Normally, such interruptions were routine, barely noticed. But this time, the intrusion felt jarring, like someone opening a door during a delicate conversation. The senior producer reached quickly to mute the channel, offering an apologetic gesture toward the stage. Dean did not react with irritation. Instead, he waited patiently, almost graciously allowing the room to reset before continuing. That small act, barely a few seconds long, carried more weight than any dramatic response could have. It signaled confidence, composure, and an understanding that the moment was bigger than any minor disruption. When he resumed, his tone remained steady, unaffected, as though the interruption had simply been another breath between phrases. Inside the booth, the skeptical executive leaned back slowly, exhaling through his nose. "He didn't lose it," he murmured, almost to himself. The senior producer glanced at him. "Lose what?" The executive hesitated, then shook his head slightly. "The connection," he said. "Most people would have." That word connection hung in the air. It was not something easily quantified, yet everyone in that room understood its value. Trends could be bought, marketing could be engineered, but genuine connection, when an audience feels seen, heard, and respected, was rare and difficult to replace. As the final notes of the second segment settled into silence, this time the pause did not feel uncertain. It felt deliberate, almost reverent. No one rushed to speak. The young assistant, who earlier had seemed nervous, now stood completely still, though afraid that even the sound of shifting his weight might break whatever had just formed in the room. Finally, a single pair of hands began to clap softly, not performative, just instinctive. It came from one of the older technicians who had worked in the studio long enough to remember nights when the building itself now seemed to vibrate with music. The sound was not loud, but it was sincere. Another person joined, then another, until a modest but genuine applause filled the space, not the thunder of a premiere, but something quieter and, in many ways, more meaningful. Dean inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, not basking in the reaction, but accepting it with the same humility that had defined his approach all afternoon. He did not treat the applause as validation. He treated it as gratitude, as shared recognition that the moment had mattered. In the control booth, the skeptical executive set his pen down completely. "We may have misread this," he said, voice low but clear. The senior producer crossed his arms, considering. "Or maybe," he replied, "we were measuring the wrong things." Neither statement was dramatic, yet together they marked a subtle shift from evaluation to reconsideration. Outside the studio, word began to travel in small, quiet ways. A technician stepping into the hallway mentioned that the session was going better than expected. A coordinator, overhearing, sent a brief message to another department. No announcements, no headlines, just the slow ripple of changed perception moving through the building. Back on stage, Dean rested his hand lightly on the microphone stand again, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. He was not thinking about contracts or future schedules. He was thinking about the simple truth that had guided him for years. Do the work honestly, and let the outcome arrive in its own time. The room's energy had shifted, but he did not cling to it. Experience had taught him that chasing momentum often made it disappear. The senior producer stepped forward slightly, speaking toward the stage. "We'd like to try one more piece," he said. His tone had changed, less cautious now, more respectful. Something simpler. The request carried an unspoken acknowledgement. They were no longer testing whether he belonged. They were exploring what was possible. Dean gave a small nod, faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not triumphant, just quietly assured. Simplicity had always been his strength. In a world that often equated impact with volume, he understood that sometimes the most powerful statement was delivered without excess. As the next cue prepared, the studio lights seemed warmer than before, their glow reflecting off polished surfaces in a way that made the space feel less like a proving ground and more like a place of collaboration. People adjusted their positions, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. The atmosphere, once cautious, now carried a quiet anticipation, and in that subtle transformation from doubt to curiosity, from evaluation to engagement, the studio itself felt different, as though the narrative that had been quietly forming earlier in the day was being rewritten in real time. No grand declaration had been made, no dramatic confrontation staged. Just a series of moments, steady, sincere, unforced, that gradually shifted perception as Dean took his breath to begin again. The room leaned in, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. The decision about his future had not yet been spoken aloud, but something more important had already happened. The assumption that he was finished had lost its certainty, and sometimes, in places built on noise and spectacle, that quiet loss of certainty is the exact moment when everything begins to change. By the time the third segment was being prepared, the studio no longer felt like a place quietly closing a chapter. It felt like a room standing at the edge of a decision no one had planned to make that day. The earlier caution had not disappeared entirely, but it had changed shape, transforming from doubt into something far more uncomfortable for those who preferred predictable, outcomes uncertainty. In the control booth, papers that had once been neatly stacked were now scattered across the console. Not from chaos, but from distraction, as if the people responsible for making final calls were suddenly less confident about the direction they had agreed upon in private. Meetings just days before, Dean stood near the edge of the stage, hands relaxed at his sides, watching technicians adjust a light that had shifted slightly out of alignment. He wasn't studying them with impatience. He was simply present, the way he always had been when waiting between takes. Years in the industry had taught him that moments like these, small pauses between decisions, often carried more weight than the performances themselves. This was where opinions hardened or softened, where quiet conversations could reshape plans that had seemed certain an hour earlier. Behind the glass, the skeptical executive stepped away from the console and spoke in a low voice to the senior producer. "We need to think carefully about how this looks," he said, choosing his words with deliberate calm. "If we pivot now, it changes the schedule we already approved." The producer folded his arms, gaze still drifting back toward the stage. "Schedules can be adjusted," he replied. "Losing something genuine is harder to fix." The exchange was not heated, but beneath its professional tone lived a tension that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with pride. Decisions made in quiet rooms are not easily reversed without someone feeling that their earlier judgment is being questioned. A younger coordinator, headset resting around her neck, listened from a few feet away, unsure whether she should pretend not to hear. She had entered the industry believing that the biggest moments would be loud arguments, dramatic declarations, sudden announcements, but what she was witnessing instead was a far subtler struggle. It wasn't about who could speak the loudest. It was about who was willing to admit that the situation in front of them no longer matched the assumptions they had carried in. On stage, Dean took a slow breath, feeling the familiar rhythm settle into place. He could sense the shift behind the glass even without hearing the exact words. Rooms have a way of broadcasting tension through silence alone, the way people move more carefully, the way conversations pause when someone else approaches. He had been in enough studios to recognize when a decision was being weighed that involved him but wasn't yet ready to be spoken aloud. The third piece selected for the session had not originally been part of the plan. It was simpler on paper, fewer musical turns, less technical demand, but emotionally it required honesty that couldn't be faked. Earlier that week, someone had suggested including it just in case, a safety option if the more demanding segments proved too much. Now, ironically, it had become the most revealing choice available as the cue was prepared. A production assistant hurried into the booth with a small envelope, whispering something to the executive. He opened it, scanned the contents, and his expression tightened not with anger, but with the kind of concern that appears when external pressures enter a room already full of delicate decisions. He passed the note to the senior producer, who read it and exhaled slowly. The message was brief, a reminder from upper management about upcoming programming priorities and the importance of aligning with current audience trends. No direct orders, just a nudge, yet in environments driven by ratings. Nudges often carry the weight of commands. The executive tapped the edge of the console thoughtfully. "We may need to wrap this sooner than planned," he said, voice low. "If we extend, it complicates next week's rollout." The senior producer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the glass at Dean, who stood quietly under the warm lights, waiting without fidgeting, without demanding updates. There was something in that stillness, steady, unpressured, that made the idea of cutting the session feel less like efficiency and more like avoidance. "Let's at least hear this one," the producer said at last. It wasn't defiance. It was a request for fairness. On stage, the first notes began soft, almost conversational. Dean didn't step forward dramatically. He simply leaned slightly toward the microphone, as though speaking to someone seated a few feet away. The delivery carried no urgency to impress. It carried an invitation to listen. In a world increasingly shaped by louder, faster performances, the restraint itself felt unusual, almost bold in its simplicity. At first, a few people in the room shifted their weight, as if unsure how to respond to something so unforced. Then the tone settled in, warm and grounded, carrying a kind of sincerity that bypassed analysis and landed somewhere more instinctive. The young coordinator in the booth felt her shoulders relax without realizing it. One of the technicians, who had been checking levels out of habit, stopped adjusting the dial entirely. Halfway through the piece, the door at the back of the studio opened quietly. A senior network representative, someone not originally scheduled to attend, stepped inside, accompanied by an assistant. He had heard through the subtle grapevine of hallway conversations that the rehearsal was going differently than expected. He remained near the entrance, observing without interrupting. His expression neutral but attentive. The presence of someone higher up might have unsettled many performers. Yet Dean did not change his pace or tone. If he noticed the new arrival, he gave no sign. His focus remained on the story within the song, the quiet arc of doubt turning into understanding. That steadiness, unaffected by shifting circumstances, carried its own kind of authority. Inside the booth, the executive noticed the newcomer and straightened slightly. The stakes, already delicate, now felt heavier. Cutting the session abruptly in front of a senior observer could look careless. Continuing might imply a shift in priorities that hadn't been formally approved. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the voice from the stage comm, measured, unmistakably present, as the final lines approached. The room seemed to lean forward collectively, not out of obligation, but out of genuine attention. The performance did not build toward a dramatic crescendo. Instead, it resolved with a quiet clarity that left space for the meaning to settle. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt deeper than before, less uncertain. It's more reflective. The senior network representative exchanged a glance with the producer. "How long has he been in?" he asked softly. "About an hour," the producer replied. The representative nodded once, still watching the stage. "Feels longer," he said, not as criticism, but as acknowledgement that time had stretched in a way it only does when people are fully engaged a few seconds later. Applause began again, slightly stronger this time, still sincere. It wasn't orchestrated, and that was precisely why it mattered. No one had signaled for it. It rose naturally from the room. Dean inclined his head in thanks, and stepped back from the microphone, hands resting loosely at his sides. He did not look toward the booth for approval. He simply waited, comfortable with whatever came next. That composure and hurried, uneasy shifted the dynamic in a way that no argument could. It suggested that his value did not depend on a single decision made behind glass. In the booth, the executive finally spoke, quieter than before. "If we end this now," he said, "it'll feel like we didn't give the moment its due." The producer nodded slowly. The earlier note about trends still lay on the console, but its urgency had faded in the presence of something more immediate, the clear response of the room. The senior network representative stepped a little closer to the glass, watching Dean with a thoughtful expression. "What was the original plan for this slot?" he asked. The executive answered honestly. "A short test. Nothing confirmed." The representative considered that, then said, "Sometimes tests tell you more than schedules do." No grand decision was announced. No contracts appeared. Yet the atmosphere had shifted from cautious evaluation to genuine reconsideration. The narrative that had quietly labeled the session as a polite farewell no longer fit what everyone had just experienced. On stage, the lights hummed softly overhead, casting a steady glow that felt less like interrogation and more like welcome. Dean adjusted the microphone one last time, not because he needed to, but because small, familiar gestures keep moments grounded. He glanced across the room at the technicians. The assistants, the producers, offering a simple, appreciative smile that carried neither triumph nor relief, just gratitude for being heard. And in that steady, unforced close to the segment, something subtle but powerful settled into place, the assumption that he was finished. Had not been defeated by a dramatic speech or a desperate push, had simply lost its foundation. When a room begins to question its own certainty, the direction of the story changes, often quietly, often without anyone realizing the exact second it happened. As conversations resumed in low, thoughtful tones and the next steps were quietly discussed behind the glass, the studio no longer felt like a space preparing to move on. It felt like a place standing at the threshold of a different decision, one shaped not by trend reports or cautious memos, but by the unmistakable presence of something authentic that refused to be reduced to a statistic. And sometimes, in environments built on constant noise, the most powerful turning point is not an explosion of applause, but the moment when the people responsible for closing a door realize almost all at once that they're no longer sure they want it closed at all. Asterisk. By the time the final segment of the session approached, the studio no longer felt like a place waiting to confirm an ending. It felt like a room carefully deciding how to acknowledge a truth that had revealed itself without asking permission. The earlier tension had not vanished, it had simply matured into something quieter and more serious. The kind of atmosphere that settles in when people realize that the decision in front of them carries more weight than a simple scheduling adjustment. Conversations behind the glass were now slower, measured, and deliberate, as though every word spoken might become part of a story someone would remember long after the day was over. Dean stood near the center of the stage, the warm lights resting gently across his shoulders. Not harsh or interrogating anymore, but almost welcoming. He did not pace or rehearse lines under his breath. Instead, he waited with the steady patience that had defined his entire career. Hands loosely folded, posture relaxed yet dignified. Years of experience had taught him that the final moments of any session were rarely about performance alone. They were about presence, about whether the room believed what it had just witnessed was real. Inside the control booth, the senior producer placed both hands on the console and looked through the glass with a long, thoughtful pause. The earlier memo about trends still lay off to the side, its printed words now seeming oddly distant compared to the living reality unfolding on the stage. The skeptical executive, who had once been certain that the day would confirm a quiet transition toward newer faces, now stared at the monitor with an expression that carried something unfamiliar for him, not doubt about Dean's ability, but doubt about his own earlier certainty. "We need to decide how we frame this," the executive said finally, voice lower than before. It wasn't resistance. It was an admission that the narrative they had prepared no longer matched the moment. The producer nodded slowly. "Maybe," he replied, "we don't frame it at all. Maybe we just let people see what we're seeing." That suggestion hung in the air like a risk, because in an industry built on careful messaging, allowing authenticity to speak without polish required a kind of courage that spreadsheets could not measure. Near the back of the studio, the senior network representative who had arrived unexpectedly watched the exchange through the glass, arms relaxed at his sides. He was not known for dramatic reactions. His reputation had been built on quiet, calculated decisions. Yet even he could not ignore the shift that had settled into the room. He turned to his assistant and murmured, "Sometimes the audience recognizes truth faster than we do." The assistant nodded, unsure whether to respond. Sensing that this was less a comment and more a realization spoken aloud, on stage, the final piece prepared for the session was not the most technically complex or the most emotionally intense. It was, in many ways, the simplest chosen, originally as a closing formality. But simplicity, when carried with honesty, has a way of revealing more than elaborate displays ever could. Dean stepped closer to the microphone, adjusting it slightly, the familiar gesture grounding the moment. Before the cue began, he looked across the room, not searching for approval, but acknowledging the people present. Technicians, assistants, producers, executives, each one part of the quiet ecosystem that turns a performance into something shared. His expression held no trace of urgency, no plea for validation. It carried only calm appreciation. The kind that comes from someone who has already made peace with whatever outcome arrives. The first notes started soft, unadorned, almost conversational. Dean didn't push the sound outward. He allowed it to settle naturally into the space, as though he were telling a story meant for a small circle rather than a broadcast audience. The restraint drew attention rather than losing it. In the booth, the executive found himself leaning forward without realizing it. elbows resting lightly on the console. Halfway through the piece, something subtle, yet unmistakable happened. The room stopped feeling like a workplace entirely. The low mechanical hum of equipment faded into the background, and even the faint rustle of someone shifting papers disappeared. What remained was a shared stillness, dozens of people, each with different roles and priorities momentarily aligned in a single experience. No one had asked for silence. It had formed on its own. The senior network representative glanced around, noticing how even the busiest technicians had paused their habitual movements. He had seen countless rehearsals, countless auditions, countless attempts to manufacture impact. This was different. There was no effort to impress, only a steady presence that made the moment feel genuine. As the final lines approached, Dean's voice did not rise for a dramatic finish. Instead, it softened slightly, carrying a warmth that felt less like performance and more like gratitude. The last note faded into the studio, lingering just long enough for its meaning to settle before dissolving into quiet. For a heartbeat then, no one moved. The silence was not empty. It was full, dense with recognition. It was the kind of pause that happens when people realize they have been listening more deeply than they intended. Then, from somewhere near the middle row of equipment, a single clap sounded, firm, unforced. Another followed, then several more, until the studio filled with applause that was neither explosive nor staged, but undeniably sincere. It rose steadily, carried by people who were not instructed to react, only moved to do so. Dean inclined his head, accepting the moment with humility. He did not spread his arms or step forward dramatically. He simply stood, calm and grounded, as the sound settled around him. For him, the applause was not proof of relevance. It was a shared acknowledgement that something honest had just occurred. Inside the booth, the executive exhaled slowly, a faint, almost incredulous smile touching his face. "We were ready to close the door," he said quietly. The producer looked at him, then back at the stage. "Looks like the door never actually closed," he replied. The senior network representative stepped forward, pressing the talkback button so his voice could carry gently into the studio. "Dean," he said, tone respectful and clear, "thank you for today." He paused, choosing his next words carefully, not for drama, but for accuracy. What we just saw wasn't a farewell rehearsal. It was a reminder. The room grew even quieter. "If that were possible, a reminder," he continued, "that authenticity doesn't follow trends, it creates its own time." No grand contract was waved in the air. No immediate announcement of future specials or schedules was made. Instead, something more meaningful happened. The assumption that had quietly labeled the day as the end was replaced with a different understanding: that presence, integrity, and genuine connection do not expire simply because the calendar moves forward. Dean nodded once, a small, grateful gesture. He did not respond with a speech. Words, in that moment, would have added more than necessary. His calm acceptance carried its own message, that he had never been there to fight for relevance, only to offer what he had always offered: honesty, delivered with dignity. As people began to move again, technicians resetting equipment, assistants gathering notes, the energy in the room had changed permanently. Conversations were lighter, more respectful, threaded with a quiet excitement that had not been scheduled into the day. The young assistant, who had once clutched cue cards nervously, now spoke with a colleague in a low, amazed tone. "I thought we were watching the end of something," he said. The colleague shook her head gently. "Maybe we were," she replied, "just not the end we expected." Dean stepped away from the microphone, the polished floor reflecting the warm studio lights beneath his feet. He paused for a brief moment at the edge of the stage, looking back not to memorize the room, but to appreciate it. Places like this had given him a lifetime of memories. And now, instead of closing with quiet dismissal, the day had offered something rarer: recognition without spectacle. As he walked toward the exit, several crew members offered nods of respect, not exaggerated, not performative, just sincere. The senior producer met him near the door. "We'll be in touch," he said, but this time the phrase did not sound like a polite ending. It sounded like an open path. Dean smiled softly. "Take your time," he replied, voice warm. "Good things usually do." Outside the studio, the hallway that had earlier felt heavy with uncertainty now carried a different atmosphere, still quiet, but no longer final. The fluorescent lights hummed as before, yet the air seemed lighter, as though the building itself had exhaled. Behind him, inside Studio B, conversations continued, plans reconsidered, assumptions revised, possibilities discussed without the pressure of immediate headlines. The narrative had shifted not because someone demanded it, but because authenticity had made denial impossible, and as the door closed gently behind him, the truth that had settled over the room remained. They had said he was finished. But what they discovered without fanfare, without argument, was that genuine presence does not fade on command. It endures quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when people are willing to see it again. Sometimes the most powerful comeback is not a loud declaration. Sometimes it is a room full of professionals, known for skepticism, standing in unexpected silence, realizing that what they thought had ended had simply never left.